Welcome. This webinar is Writing About History, and I'm Julie Johnson Archer with the Online Writing Center here at ACU Dallas. We are glad to have you here and have you watching this particular webinar. I am going to be using an assignment from History 118, the Western Civilization course, as an example to go over some of the concepts. However, if you're not in that class, maybe you are an undergrad taking non-history courses or a graduate student and you're not going to be taking this particular class, hang tight. This will also be applicable to your writing because many courses ask you to reflect on the history of a certain event maybe in your field, or talk about the history of a particular theory or practice in your field. So I think a lot of these concepts will be applicable broadly. Um, and if you are here and you have questions throughout the webinar, please ask them. We'll use the chat room for our time together. This webinar will be recorded. So like all our webinars, you'll have access to this recording and these slide decks on our website. So you can go and download this presentation if you would like to refer back to it later. As we get started, here's a little bit of information about the Online Writing Center. And specifically for our undergraduate students, I want to let you know about the resources you have available to you. Only in the last year did the Writing Center open up for undergrads to use us and use our tutoring service. So if you've never come and had a tutoring appointment, we've got this succinct video tutorial that walks you through the process of making that first appointment and submitting your paper to get feedback from a tutor in the Writing Center. For all students, we work with you at any stage of your writing, and you can send us something that's unfinished. You don't feel ready to submit it to your professor, that's just fine. Even if you have submitted something to your professor, though after the fact you've received a grade and had some feedback, you're welcome to submit something like that to us as well. So we're happy to work with you to develop your writing skills with whatever you have available. If you are signing up for an appointment, be aware that those appointments are asynchronous by nature. So currently on our schedule, if you sign up, all you'll need to do is upload your paper by the time of your appointment, and then we'll send you feedback within 24 hours of the time of your appointment. And you'll receive that feedback via email. We know that some students are interested in phone, Zoom appointments, real-time connection with a tutor, and you can always request that. And the best way to do that, if you've never interacted with us before, is just email us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. Later down the line, maybe you have worked with a tutor a few times and you can just send that tutor an email directly to set up a time that works for the both of you. Also, all students have access to a lot of resources and blog posts, sample papers, all on the Writing Center's website, which is linked here. So in a nutshell, the first thing you'll need to do to make a Writing Center appointment is save your appointment in WC Online. WC Online is our scheduling appointment system. It's linked on the previous page as well, and you can access it from any course in Canvas. So you can schedule an appointment, you can schedule it up to 2 weeks in advance, and anytime before your appointment, make sure you go in and submit your paper to that week's Canvas link. You're allowed 2 appointments per week with us, so there will be 2 different links. If it's your first paper, you'll use the first link. Second paper, you'll use the second link. Then that's all you need to do. You'll receive feedback from your tutor within 24 hours. Each term, we have a great list of webinars that we conduct live. And so a couple upcoming webinars that I would like to point out to you on our schedule for this term: Avoiding Plagiarism with APA 7th edition. That's on Tuesday, February 2nd. And we recommend this for all students, whether you're familiar with APA, you're a pro, or you're just learning it and jumping back into school maybe after a long while. These are really important concepts that we all need to work on, so we recommend watching that webinar. Then later, February 9th, also a Tuesday, we have Beyond Summary, Adding Analysis and Synthesis to Your Writing. And that's a really good follow-up to this webinar, actually, because I will be talking about synthesis in our writing and that skill and the things that go into improving our synthesis skills in writing. But that's a dedicated webinar to analysis and synthesis and what those terms mean and what your professors are looking for when they say analyze this or synthesize these materials. Again, all of our webinar recordings are available on our website. So if you're interested in these things, we've already got recordings. You can go watch them right now on our website. We also have a fairly new YouTube channel, which we are in the process of updating, making playlists of videos, tutorials, and webinars. So if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and click there and follow us on YouTube. So the two objectives for the rest of this webinar: first, writing about history in APA style specifically. So we're going to go over APA rules and guidelines when writing about historical events or using really old texts, and etc. The second piece is to understand and practice paraphrasing, summarizing, and synthesizing information. And again, we're going to use a specific example from History 118 as our starting point. I think these objectives are woven throughout the webinar. So here we go. Let's go ahead and get started. Writing about history in APA style. So whether you're writing about the development of a certain theory, like I said, and how it's maybe changed over the course of decades in your field, or maybe you are actually tasked with writing about a specific historical event or person, maybe writing about World War II. One goal in all of these tasks is to certainly show your professor that you understand what happened. You do this by summarizing the information. So being able to write a well-organized explanation of the book burnings in Nazi Germany, for example, would be important if that's the topic that you're supposed to write about for a given assignment. However, in general, writing about history takes more than just summarizing historical events. You're not writing a textbook necessarily, you're obviously going to be reading them, but there's something more that your professors expect, generally speaking, than simply summarizing what happened. So a second but equally important goal to keep in mind is showing your professor you can think critically about those events. And this is where synthesis comes into play. Now, this is very similar, like I said, to the advice we give students who are writing literature reviews and other graduate assignments. Literature reviews are an assignment required in many programs at ACU. And a literature review does not stop at summarizing a bunch of information. Instead, the goal of literature reviews is to organize the information in a way that shows where your research will fit in with what has already been written on a given topic. It's supposed to be an interesting presentation of all of this information. So for example, if you're writing about the book burnings in Germany, you might give an overview of the events of 1933, why totalitarianism targets culture and literature, and talk about censorship of certain ideas and voices. However, you wouldn't want to just stop there. In order to synthesize these ideas, you would need to show that you understand the significance of these events and begin making connections, maybe to your own context, maybe to other historical events. It can look a lot of different ways. Let's say your research topic is actually leadership in US politics. You might be able to begin drawing a comparison between censorship in totalitarian regimes and the actions of US politicians, whether for good or bad. Um, but making these connections over time, that's one way to think critically about historical events, right? This is often the work of really good historians, actually. They write the story of history as a way to understand how we got here, who we are today, and who we might become even moving forward. So, synthesis in your papers can take shape in a variety of ways as long as you're taking the information and making original claims and conclusions from your perspective. And if you just joined us, welcome. Go ahead and type into the chat room. We're just getting started here. Type in the chat room what program you're pursuing. That'll help me if you're taking a history class or even not, it'll help me gear some of this information perhaps towards what you are working on. So, we're talking about synthesis in history papers or when you're writing about historical events. So, first, this can look like highlighting patterns or connections that you see in the information. If you listen to a historical speech, you might be able to pull out a theme from that speech. For instance, listening to President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, or I guess reading it more likely, is a great example. In it, he is casting a vision for what this nation might become, even as it is in the midst of a great crisis. There are many speeches from presidents, social justice leaders, other world leaders alike who were in the midst of a crisis, like depressions, wars, disease, or hatred. And you could choose just one to read a few times to discover a theme or a pattern in the language that you find particularly compelling or influential. Synthesis can also look like comparing different points of view and offering your own conclusions. The course that we'll be looking at in a little while, History 118, which is Western Civilization, has a discussion post about the competing worldviews of the US and Soviet Union. So you'll be asked in that discussion post to read speeches from Vladimir Lenin about communism and then from Woodrow Wilson about liberalism. And this is a great example of where a professor is wanting you to synthesize by comparing two different points of view. Pointing out the key themes and differences between these points of view is key to understanding the different trajectories of both nations. Great, we have someone who's actually in this course, so the information in this is highly relevant. We're actually going to go over an upcoming assignment, so stick around for that. Glad you can make it. All right, moving on, talking more about synthesis. So, similarly to comparison, synthesis can involve making connections between past and current events. So, how did those speeches in 1917 and 1918 impact the language and the worldviews of later politicians in each nation? Speculating on these connections doesn't have to be an exact science. In fact, it's really hard or difficult to say, well, because Lenin used these terms, um, this event happened. Sometimes making those correlations is an educated guess or um, a logical argument that you make and that's great. So for instance, Wilson's 14 points speech has a particular theme of openness, of peace and equality among nations, which you might be able to connect to recent politicians' language. And just the fact that you're making that connection, that would make for an interesting discussion post, I think. Okay, another way you might have synthesis in your papers is by creating new interpretations of historical events through a particular lens or a theory that you're learning about. So, for instance, if you're a marriage and family studies or conflict resolution student at ACU, you might take family systems theory and interpret a past event or a case study through that lens, showing how individuals' actions or reactions are connected to that larger family dynamic as a whole. And history students, especially in 118, will look at a particular concept like Nazi eugenics and see how that theory was carried out through the Holocaust. This might lead to making a nuanced claim that racism in all forms throughout history has begun not with personal one on one hatred, but with language of dehumanization. It's not natural to humans to harm one another, but spreading this idea that one group's status is lower than another's allows for that development of hatred and ultimately violence against that group. So these are just examples, talking very theoretically at this point, and we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of this in a little while. Whenever you're given the task to write a discussion post or a full-on essay, it's good to jot down a brief outline to give your writing an overall structure before you begin. So here are a few examples of essay structures that you can use to organize your thoughts and end up with a coherent essay. And this is not an exhaustive list, by the way, of different kinds of essays and how you can structure them. But it's a starting place, and I found that we can all use a little help getting started writing, which is sometimes the hardest part, I think. So each of these structures depends on what you've been asked to do by the professor. If you've been asked to discuss the causes or effects of historical events, your essay might be structured somewhat chronologically or linearly with beginning, middle, and end. So your introduction paragraph can set the stage and state the general topic of your essay, and it should also contain your thesis statement. This is the key argument of your paper. Basically, what is your main idea in one sentence? So I've given an example thesis statement here up at the top. Sexist criticism and dismissal of female US politicians today can in part be traced back to the women's suffrage movement and its reception in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So here, if that's the main claim of your essay, you might begin with a few paragraphs describing the events of the suffrage movement with specific examples of maybe offensive reactions to the women that were published in newspapers, and we can actually see the evidence of. Then, chronologically, kind of this cause and effect structure, you would move to more present day, giving examples of modern women in political positions who have received sexist criticism, perhaps on social media, in news, in whatever way that you are interested in. This would lead up to a paragraph making the case that sexism in US politics can be traced directly back to the 19th century. Of course, you might argue its origins are much further back in history, but for a short paper, you will have to keep your focus pretty narrow and try and make these connections clear. So I don't think you'll find yourself going too far back in history Depending on the course you're taking or what you've been asked to do, you want to still keep your topic pretty narrow. Okay, let's move to the next possible structure, which is comparative structure. So for a comparative essay, like the one about comparing Lenin and Wilson, which many of you right here will be doing in your course, you might structure your discussion post or your essay as more of this ping pong between them. For instance, you might choose 3 themes that you see in both of these speeches, and then address each theme using specific examples from both Lenin and Wilson. Here's another example of a thesis statement for this kind of essay. It's not related to Lenin Wilson, but it's one I took from another author who published this in 2019. So this isn't my own idea, but it was an interesting thesis, and so it was under this type of essay of comparative structure. The thesis was centuries-old indigenous pottery techniques of the Appalachian region indicate durable social networks existed that are similar to modern use of social media. So that's an interesting claim. And those are seemingly disconnected. Perhaps you don't think of social media when you think of these really old pottery techniques and ceramics that have been found in anthropology. But you can make that connection or make dissimilar things connected as you're thinking through this critically. Finally, all essays are persuasive to an extent because you're making claims, you're backing them up with your logic and evidence from the research you're doing. A specifically persuasive essay structure, though, might go through a few key claims or arguments to lead the reader to believe or act in a certain way. You might want to change someone's mind or get them to think about something in a new way. So an example thesis for this essay might be, contrary to popular opinion, shame is not an effective tool for changing others' actions. Instead, accountability for one's actions makes democracy and unity possible. So that's a large claim about shame and accountability. But you might have a few paragraphs dedicated to giving specific examples, perhaps from the readings that you were doing that week, of where shame has been used to try to get people to change their minds, their opinions, but it was followed with unsatisfactory results. So giving examples, maybe one example per paragraph, that's great. Connect it back to your thesis, and you've got a persuasive structure for your essay. And by the way, if you are just joining us and you have questions, you have ideas that you're working through in your own history class right now, great. If you have questions, just enter them into the chat room. And that's the way you can interact with me. My colleague Basil Constantine is also here, so we'll get to your questions as soon as we can, but we welcome them. So now we're going to dig into more of the details about APA formatting. What does APA require when you're actually doing the citations for different kinds of historical texts in your writing? So here are a few of the rules and examples with each rule that might be good to come back to as you're actually writing. So again, you might come back to this slide. It'll be published on our website, on our webinar page, and so you can refer back to this right there. So this first example is if you cite a republished text. And what that means is that the original text was published really long ago, usually, and it has since gone out of print and been republished, often in a new format, because it's been so long. So, for example, the Cambridge edition of the King James Bible was published in 1769. And then it was much more recently published online, so in a new format, in 2007. So you would include both dates, the original publication date and that newer date, in your citation, just like in this example. This is to cite a book by Heidegger that has been republished, and then you'll include the first publication date. So Heidegger, 1961 was that first publication. And then you'll just separate the old date from the new date with a / 2008. If you're citing something that is perhaps so old that the exact publication date is not even known, you can use the abbreviation for circa, meaning approximately, in your citation. And you've probably seen this if you're reading historical texts. Maybe if they use an idea from Aristotle, for example, you might include this next example, Aristotle, and then in parentheses, circa or CA period, 350 BCE. And again, that's the original approximate date that this was first said into the world. But then we have a republication date of 1994. And you might also see BCE in your reading. And if you're wondering what that means, it's before the Common Era. And so you might also see BC, just the two letters BC, and that means before Christ. So if you're reading specifically texts from the Christian historical world, you might see BC. If you're writing about something that's that old, APA would say use BCE, before the Common Era. In most cases, when you're citing in APA, you don't have to include the database in your reference entry. Most databases that you might be using, you might think of JSTOR, EBSCOhost, Google Scholar even. Those are all databases that you can find a lot of resources from. And those articles in those databases are usually widely available. You can find them in multiple places, and they're really easy to access. So in those instances, you don't need to include the database in your reference entry. But I wanted to mention, if you're doing research that involves resources that are in limited circulation, they're hard to get to, they're only in one place, you should include the database information in those instances. For example, you might use works from university archives or a special collection that houses the only versions of a text that are even available to the public. And in that case, again, you would mention the archive or the database name in your reference entry. For example, ACU Library has a Millikan Special Collections, and this is maybe EDD students would go there, or business students and people interested in administration, in education. They house all of ACU's academic records. It's got presidential documents, that things that they've signed, they've said, promotional materials over history. So there's a lot of interesting information, but it's specific to ACU, and you're not really going to find that anywhere else. So in your citation, you would list Millikan Special Collections as the database. Okay, so we're going to continue talking about citing in APA. If you are citing the oral history or traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, maybe that's your research topic, you're going to capitalize most terms related to Indigenous peoples. And So including tribes, nations, as well as terms for individuals within tribal communities like elder, and terms that hold specific meaning like traditional knowledge or oral history. As with all of your research projects, it's important to carefully check the accuracy of your sources, especially if those sources are really old. Um, Reading back into history, you might get some information that's inaccurate, it's biased, it might perpetuate some of these stereotypes that now we know are not true. So that's one thing to be careful about, really, with research on any population. But APA has put out these guidelines to protect Indigenous peoples specifically who have not always had that protection in academic research historically. If you're presenting an oral history of an Indigenous person, whether you conducted an interview or you listened to someone else's interview, maybe on YouTube, you can find some of these interviews. You're just going to cite it in the text based on the type of source you used. So you can follow standard APA citation templates for these types of sources, but I'm going to give you a few examples. Here's an example of using a resource also in limited circulation in this first example. So I don't actually have the audio recording. I would have to go to the University of New Mexico maybe to go listen to this or reach out and request special online access. Um, Here's an example of someone who interviewed an anonymous person, resident of the Tzia Pueblo in New Mexico, and you can access that audio recording only in the American Indian Oral History Collection. And so that's what you would include there in your citation. And you'll notice after the interviewer's name, the interview was conducted in 1968. We've got that title of the audio, Interview with Anonymous is what it's actually called. And then in brackets, we've got a description. And this goes for lots of different types of citations. If it were a video, you could put video here. In this case, interview audio recording. That's great. It describes the type of resource because otherwise we wouldn't necessarily know the format. So that's another thing to know about APA is you can include in brackets a description of what that is. If it's artwork, a painting, whatever, you can put that in brackets. Then in the text itself, you would maybe write a sentence like this with that source. In an interview with a Native American resident of Tzia Pueblo in New Mexico, and describe maybe something that you listened to. And again, just like normal, we've given the author's last name, comma, 1968, in parentheses, just to give credit to this resource. And then if you're the one who's doing the interview yourself, which would be, great firsthand research experience. You might not be doing that for History 118. You might, but something to consider if you're going to do your own interview, you would cite that as a personal communication. And this goes really for any interview you would conduct for a course assignment. So for example, I spoke with an individual from the Ojibwe Nation, and then in parentheses, with their permission, of course, you would describe where they lives in Michigan, and then personal communication, comma, and the approximate date. You can give the exact date if you have it, January 2021. So for future reference, maybe that's how you cite an interview. It would also be how you cite an email, something that your audience or your reader doesn't have access to. It's just a personal communication, and you don't have a reference entry for that in your reference list either. So a few more examples before we go and start applying this to the example assignment. This is a pretty specific type of source, a republished book, and even a republished book in translation. You might use a republished book like we've talked about already, or you might have a book in translation from another language. So let's take a look at what it would look like if you're working with a book that's both republished and one that's in translation. So Freud's interpretation of dreams is this first example. It was originally published in 1899 in German, and it has since been republished in translation, 2010. So here's how you'd format that reference entry. Freud, comma, S, 2010. So we're putting that first, the most recent date. The interpretation of dreams, the complete and definitive text. It's got an editor and translator. And so you put ED for editor and TRANS for translator, and then the publisher. Again, we give the original work published date, 1899, in parentheses at the end. Now, this is a source that we have already used in English. It wasn't in German when we read it, so that's all you need to do. Corresponding in-text citation, again, looks similar to what we've seen. If you are using text in another language, maybe you speak multiple languages, that's awesome. You're definitely allowed to do that in your writing. What APA recommends is including a translation of the title, your own translation, in brackets. So if you have this resource, Historia Sociolingüística de México, you can give your own translation because it's not a source that's in English, it's in Spanish, and you might say sociolinguistic history of Mexico in brackets, and that just gives the reader, if it's an English audience, English-speaking audience, it gives them an idea of that source's information or topic. All right, and then you will likely be citing textbooks, history textbooks or other textbooks for your courses. So you'll just cite textbooks like any other book in APA. You've got, for example, here's a reference entry of Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And you'll notice that book title is italicized. And we've got the publisher, HarperCollins. Now, I do want to point out, we've looked at republished books that have multiple editions, or for example, Howard Zinn's book, this textbook, was originally published in 1980 and it has multiple editions since then. You only need to list the most recent publication date in this type of reference because the work didn't go out of print before its republication. So there's that slight difference. And in general, for most of your textbooks and other regular recent books, you don't need to include an original publication date. So it's really simple. In text, you would just have Zinn, 2003 for that in-text citation. Okay, so here's a great point to think back on all of the APA information I've given you. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. We're going to switch gears now and actually look at the upcoming assignment, The Rights of Women's Workers from History 118. I've given you also on this slide a link to the APA 7th edition template. And if you're unfamiliar with our template, I'll go ahead and pull it up and show you what it looks like. In just a moment, I'll go over the assignment first. So again, this is specifically for History 118 students, but if you're not in that class, I think you'll get to see how you might use the template as part of your writing process to create some outlining, give yourself some structure, and have a successful essay by the end of it. So the purpose of this assignment says is to acquire knowledge of the interconnections between industrialization, labor, gender, and workers' rights. So the implications of the Industrial Revolution went far beyond technological and economic progress. Industrialization left a significant mark in modern society, engendering urbanization, environmental issues, the need for social reform, workers' rights, and prompted women to enter the workforce. So we've got a lot of great information from the start of this prompt. Here is the actual task. Read the materials, all right, for this week's readings, and write a 1,000-word essay considering the following question prompts. And he's actually listed 7 prompts. I'll go over them briefly just so we get an idea of the task at hand. So, who were the girls who came to work for the newly opened mills in Lowell, Massachusetts? What reasons did they seek employment? What life skills and experiences would have assisted their work as industrial workers? And then describe the daily life of a mill girl, Lowell mill girl. What kind of working conditions did she face? And okay, we provide at least 2 examples. That's a specific instruction there. What kind of social and educational activities did she participate in? Provide, again, at least 2 examples. Great. So a lot of these questions here seem to be more in line with summary. You're going back to the readings and finding out this information, and then putting it into your paper in paragraph form. These next few questions, okay, are getting more into the critical thinking, the synthesis that I was discussing earlier. So what's the contribution of these girls to the larger labor movement at the time? And factory girls were not only part of revolutionizing industry, they began to revolutionize the role of women in industry. So after reading Lucy Ann's letter, An Independent Mill Girl, this is a great letter from 1851, how far does this revolution go? And asking these questions about the emancipation from traditional Victorian gender roles. To what extent do you think that these girls impacted gender roles and how? These are great critical thinking questions. And then finally, connecting to the present day, thinking about how these women um, were involved in social and political reforms that then influenced the 19th and 20th centuries and into the 21st. So drawing connections to today. And then, of course, we always want to check the rubric before we write or before we turn in an assignment to see what the professor's looking for. This last bullet says the essay should include these 5 things. So different people, specific events. That's great. Okay. Essay is thorough and comprehensive in its analysis and responds to the prompts. Great. Includes examples. Okay, great. Successfully connects the story of the girls to current day activism in that 7th prompt. Great, that's a large portion of the points here, 30 points. And then these last 2, written clearly, avoids grammar or spelling errors, and it's 1,000 words in APA format. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the APA template. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know in the chat room if you don't see my Microsoft Word with the template pulled up now. Make it a little larger there. Okay. So again, if you are unfamiliar with the template for essay assignments like this, it is an excellent resource because we have all of these components of APA papers already formatted for you. And we have a video here on how to use it. I highly recommend if it's your first time watching that short video. Um, and then some comments here in the margins about how to fill in this information. I'm going to go up to the Review tab in Word and go ahead and delete all the comments. That's an easy way to get rid of all of them. Okay. And now we just have the template itself. So we can go ahead and just plug in the title of this assignment. You would fill in your name, what program you're a part of at ACU, this course name, and this goes for any course, you give that abbreviation, and then the course number, 118, the instructor's name, and the due date. And this is coming up right at the end of January. So for those of you who are working on this, you're already getting ahead, which is great. Now, this assignment doesn't ask for an abstract. Most short essays will not ask you for that, so just delete it. All right, and now we put the full title of our paper again at the top of our page, page 2. And then you can go ahead and delete all of this filler text. It's a good example if you've never really internalized what an APA paper looks like. Here's a great example with different levels of heading, but we're going to delete it for our purposes. And now I just added in those 7 questions directly from the prompt into this Word document. And especially if you are looking at the assignment for a week, say it's a Tuesday like today, you're looking at the assignment, this is a great task. It takes maybe 5 to 15 minutes to just plug in the prompt to the template and give yourself a loose outline of this assignment. And the reason that we often tell students do this before you do your readings for the week, on a Tuesday or Wednesday, when you first see it, do this template then, is because then when you're going to do those readings, you have these questions in mind. You'll be looking for the answers, and it helps you save time overall, because then perhaps as you're reading and you find an answer, you can go ahead and plug that in directly into your prompt with a citation. And give yourself some great notes so that by the time you've read those materials, you've already got a really quite detailed outline. And that will really help and go a long way to making your essay fit and meet the prompt. And so let's talk about a few more things you might do with these questions before you've even done the reading. Now, 1,000 words is what we've been asked to write. And if you're thinking of double-spaced pages like you see here, it's about 250 words per page. So we're talking about a 4-page paper here for this assignment. So as you're considering how much to write for each question, that's really important. You don't want a whole page for each question. That would be 7 pages and far too much. And so we will condense some of these questions into a 1-page, a half-page section, for example. So let's go ahead, and the professor hasn't asked for subheadings, but it's a good thing to include for papers that are multi-page length, like 4 pages. That's all right. We could have a few subheadings, even just to separate this information into sections for ourselves. So I think these 4 questions to begin, they all have to do specifically with the Lowell Mill girls, so I'm just going to put that as a subheading. Now, in order to get that to format as an APA, this is called Level 2 heading. I'm going to open up under the Home tab the Styles pane. And now once Word responds, it'll pull up something on the right that allows you to see all the different styles, APA Level 1 heading, just like this title you see here, and then the other levels. So um, you can see that this current style is just body text. It looks pretty normal like the rest of the text, but we want it to look like an APA Level 2 heading. So I'm just going to push APA Level 2, and you can see, oh, it bolded it for us. Great. That's all we need to do for a level 2 heading. Now, I would recommend having an introduction paragraph for any essay that you're writing, even though that's not part of the prompt specifically. Having a brief introduction paragraph is always a good idea, as well as a conclusion paragraph. And the goals of these paragraphs, you can keep them pretty concise. You want to introduce the context and the contents of your paper. So let's look at the rest of this and we might have a better idea of all of the contents. So we might have these first 4 questions in the first section about the Lowell Mill girls. We might give a second heading as we shift here. This next question is a shift into their contribution. Again, APA Level 2, great. And you might be noticing that I'm capitalizing all of these different words with 4 or more letters. All of these important words are capitalized. And that goes for really any heading or title in your papers. So this question has to do with revolutionizing women's role. You might have a different heading though if you want to focus on revolutionizing gender roles. You can give yourself different headings depending on how you want to focus on a different section, on each section. Lastly, the impact today. So we can kind of see the overall structure here. We're going to be talking about the Lowell Mill girls, specifically moving into their contribution, the revolution of gender roles in industry, and then the impact today. And that's a great structure. The professor's kind of given it to us already. So that's great. We can work with that. So you might give a very brief introduction. This is all about the Lowell Mill girls. So you might have a sentence about them in your introduction to briefly explain who they were. And then you're going to be talking about, again, their contribution. These are just examples of how you might begin crafting an introduction paragraph. Some people get really stumped on an introduction paragraph, how to start off. But if you think of it as just summarizing, kind of giving this outline or forecast of what you're going to see in the rest of the paper, that's a great way to start. And perhaps as you write, you find that you have a really strong claim about the factory girls' impact today. And that would be your thesis statement. Fill in the blank there. But giving your thesis statement in your introduction is usually where your professor's wanting to see that main idea come through. Okay, now briefly, I want to talk about how um, you might move forward from here. So you don't obviously want to keep all of these questions in your paragraphs. You're going to need to get rid of the questions once you've answered them. You can maybe strike through them to show, okay, I've answered it, and go through that way. Or just delete them and start your paragraphs out after you've done the reading. You can always use the prompt's language in your responses. So um, it says, who were the girls who came to work for the newly opened mills in Lowell? The girls who came to work. And then you describe the girls, who they were, where they came from, maybe how old they were. And all of those details you'll get from the readings, but you can see I haven't even done the readings, but I've got a great start to this sentence. Um, and it's based directly on the prompt. So I can delete that prompt. And as you give your answers, one thing to keep in mind, this isn't the same as like a history test in high school where you could just answer each question and move on. This is going to be structured as an essay. So the topic sentences and the transitions are important. You'll want to weave these ideas together. Maybe as you are describing the girls, you can then answer this question. Uh, because of who they sought out employment for these reasons. All right, so that might be all in one paragraph, and that's fine. Really, this first section would probably be about a page to maybe a page and a half, depending on the level of detail that you include. The Lowell girls' contribution, maybe a half a page to 1 page, depending again on how many paragraphs you want to write to answer that question. Revolutionizing women's role, to answer this question, again, maybe 1 page. We've kind of split this into 4 sections. So for a 4 page paper, you can think about splitting it up in that way. Impact today, that might be a longer section, maybe a page and a half if this is only half a page. And so you can kind of plan how much you need to write on each section, even at this stage. And depending on the rubric, again, this last question is really important to answer. Um, and so you might spend a little more time and give a page and a half rather than just 1 page, and have a few solid paragraphs to answer how this experience of the girls relates to today. Okay, so with our last minute, let me go back to our slides. I hope it's helpful to see how you might begin. We've got a lot of great work uh, from the prompt already given to us, so use that as you outline your paper. Refer to these resources. Again, you can download that template here and access a lot of other resources. Of course, schedule an appointment with us at this link. And we're so glad you could join us. If you have any other questions, I'll stick around for another couple of minutes. But I hope you have a great rest of your evening and good luck writing.